All right, if you'll find your place back in Philippians again, the same text as last week in Philippians chapter 4. This morning, you're going to get scriptures from all over the Bible, and that's not typically the way in which I preach, but I am preaching upon the subject of providence, and so I will be using passages throughout the Bible, and at the end, we will come back to this one last time, and apply it specifically. But let me read Philippians 4 through 7, and then we will somewhat abandon that text for the rest of the sermon, and then when we come back to it, we'll be done. Philippians 4 and verse 4, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your reasonableness, or your gentleness, or your calmness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." All right, so now we're going to dig behind that passage in the exploration of the providence of God, and then we'll come back to see why this text makes so much sense. Let me give a definition. I had a definition of providence on the screen at one time earlier. This is a different definition, perhaps a little bit more clear. And so I will read it slowly. I don't have it on the screen, but maybe more clear, and maybe it'll sink in. I'll read it slow. If you write fast, you could even write the definition down. God's maintenance, guidance, and continuing involvement with creation and humans. Let me back up. God's maintenance, guidance, and continuing involvement with creation and humans as a means of carrying out His divine purposes in history. As a means of carrying out divine purposes in history. So put it all together. God's maintenance, God's guidance, continuing involvement with creation and humans as a means of carrying out divine purposes in history. Now, if you want to put all of that together, God is actively at work globally with everything that's created and the whole human race all over the globe, and He's actively working in all of these things to accomplish His divine purposes. So we, by that definition, rule out chance and luck and happenstance and those type of things. They're all moved out of the way. God is inserted in center stage, and He's actively involved in His creation. And the reason you're in this room today, the estate that you're in, is because God's divine providence has guided, maintained, directed you, and put you here. Whether you realize all of that or not, God's providence has brought you to this place at this time. And we'll see in the text later, if God was to withdraw breath, all creation would die. So even at this very moment, even the air that we breathe is providentially upheld by our God. So three sections. Providence in nature, providence in circumstance, providence, and I'm going to say in government. I don't mean government like the White House. I mean in how God rules and reigns over all things. So you got God's providence in nature, the sun, the stars, the rain, the hurricanes, all of nature, all the animal world. Then circumstantial things, casting lots, something happening in the midst of the day. All circumstances are under providence of God. And then lastly, His government, His reigning in sovereignty over all situations for His own glory. So those are the three areas I'd like to explore this morning. A proper understanding of providence will save us from a couple of errors. What are a couple of errors that you can fall into if you don't understand providence? Deism. Deism is an error. Deism teaches that God created the world and abandoned it. So he put it all together, and then he pulled away. It's kind of like a clock. God wound it up, and he's going to see how it ticks out. And so he's just waiting to see how this thing unfolds. That's deism. Or pantheism. Pantheism teaches that creation does not have a real, distinct existence in itself, but is only a part of God. Both of these are grievous errors. Providence teaches that though God is actively related to, and involved in the creation at each moment, creation is also distinct. God's actively involved in everything, and creation is actively involved as well at the same time. Thus, events in creation are not determined by chance, randomness, or luck. I know we're humans, and I know we just adopt phrases that just get hammered into our mind through the culture that we live in. But it's not your lucky day. It's not the random selection of choice that just happened to work out. It's not happenstance that a certain thing has come about in your life. There is a God behind all of the events, providentially putting them in that place for a purpose for His glory and your good, even if you can't understand it. If you're in prison and your name is Joseph and you interpret a dream and somebody gives you a word that they'll tell somebody that you're the one that interpreted where you'll get out and they forget, God's providence made them to forget in order that His purposes could be fulfilled at the exact time. And so even if you don't understand it while you're in prison, for those 2 years, you can understand that your God is at work and He knows what He's doing. God is continually involved in creation. God keeps all created things existing and maintains their properties that He created them with. Now, I'm not going to have you to turn to every reference. I just want you to hear. He preserves all things. So let these things build up in order that we can make one grand application at the end. Hebrews 1:3. He upholds the universe by the word of His power. Throughout this text, throughout the whole message, I'm going to be asking you, do you believe this? Do you believe this? Do you really believe this? He upholds the entire universe and everything included in what universe means. He upholds all of that by the word of His power. What am I saying? At the moment He was to remove His power, it would all fall. It would not be able to hold its orbit. So the earth would not spin at the speed it spins and keeps gravity at the exact point that it keeps gravity. If He withheld His word, it would all fly to pieces and dissolve, including us. Christ is before all things, and in Him He holds all things together. He sustains every bit of it. You see, like we have sheetrock here. Sheetrock stays sheetrock because He upholds all things. The sheetrock is not going to turn into gasoline. It's not going to start growing into a tree. He sustains it as it is, every single thing. That was Colossians 1:17. Acts 17:28. In Him we live and move and we have our being. Look, whether you're lost or whether you're saved, you have life because of Him. It's in Him that we are able to live, to have our being. Nehemiah 9:6, a wonderful passage. You are the Lord alone. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens. You've made all of their host, the earth and everything that is on it, the seas and everything that is in them, and you preserve all of them. And the host of heaven worships you. Everything that exists has come into existence and is maintained by the providence of God. Peter may say it in a different fashion, but it still implies the same thing. He says, by the same word, the heavens and the earth that now exist, the same heaven, the same earth, Peter would say that now exist, they're stored up for fire, but he says they're being kept, they're being preserved, they're being maintained until the day of judgment. All of these things, we're so worried about global warming or not global warming and how this is going to work and how that's going to work. And some people get real nervous about this, and politicians go all out of whack trying to explain all these things. Look, church, we have a God of providence, and all of creation is being kept until a final day of judgment. Yeah, there's going to be a real strong global warming at some point in the future. And everything's going to be burned up. And we have new heavens and a new earth. But that's not going to happen until God says so, because He's the one keeping it. Or I love reading the book of Job. And although it may be Elihu or one of the others speaking, they say a lot of things that are right spot on. And this is what Elihu tells us in Job 34:14 and 15. If God were to take back His Spirit, if God was to take back His breath, if He was to withdraw that from us, all life would cease. Humanity would turn again to the dust. If God just removed the breath. The psalmist says the very same thing in Psalm 104:29. He says, if you turn away from them, they panic. They panic. When you take away their breath, they die and turn again to dust. So all of creation and all of humanity is being sustained this day by the providential care of God, who's giving them air to breathe. And if God retracted that air, all would turn back to dust and be no more. This is our providence in nature and creation. Let's talk about some more specific areas. Let's talk about the weather. Nice and cloudy outside, a little cool today. We have all these weather patterns that change, and you may live in a place where there's hurricanes. You may live in a place where they have lots of tornadoes like Norman, Oklahoma. You can live in all these type of deals where they have tsunamis and things like this. What are we going to say about the weather and the providence of God? Well, in the book of Job, you will find a great and healthy description. Job 37, beginning in verse 6. For to the snow, he says, fall on the earth. You know why it snowed the other day? Because God told it to. God tells it when to snow. Likewise, the downpour of His mighty downpour. He seals up the hand of every man, that all men whom He made may know it. Then the beasts go to their lairs and remain in their dens. From its chamber comes the whirlwind, and the cold from the scattering winds. By the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen fast. He loads the thick cloud with moisture, and the clouds scatter His lightning. They turn around and around by His guidance. Think of the clouds, tornadoes and hurricanes, and the cyclical pattern of the weather. And they're going round and around, and they're doing so randomly, and we have no idea how it's going to work out. Or they're doing so under the guidance of the providence of God to accomplish all that He commands them on the face of the habitable world. Whether for correction, or for His land, or for His love, He causes it all to happen. All the weather is under the control of the Almighty. Snow fall, rain pour, lightning flash, clouds circle, wind arise. All of these under the providential care of God. How about the grass outside? Psalm 104:14. You cause the grass to grow. Why does God cause grass to grow? Because cows don't have a job. They don't make money and they can't buy feed. So He causes the grass to grow for the livestock. And plants, why do plants produce fruit? Because we need fruit to eat. So plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring food forth from the earth. Look, you can water, you can put seed in, you can do all of those things. I'm going to plant some winter rye in my yard for long. We have some green grass in the winter. But the only way that it's going to be green is if God causes it to grow. I can scatter the seed. I can even turn on the sprinkler. But God must give it life. He's the one who causes it to grow. In case you just missed that and you're lollygagging off to sleep because you're tired, listen. You could actually walk out of the door of your house, open it up, look outside at the grass, and worship. I have grass because God made it grow. Worship God in these things. Well, we got weather, we got grass. What about the stars? Now understand, I think in the book of Job, the bear, it's going to say bear. I don't think he's talking about a grizzly bear. I think the more common term is the Big Dipper. So talking about the stars. Can you lead out the constellations in their seasons or guide the bear with its cubs? Can you do that? God's saying, I can and I do. I got all the stars of heaven. Can you do that? No, I can't do that. I'm glad I have a God of providence who knows how to do that. Well, we got weather and grass and stars as we talk about providence and creation. What about the morning? Anybody here love the morning? You like the sunrise? Like to see it come up over the edge there? Job 38:12. Have you ever in your life commanded the morning, he asking? Have you ever commanded the morning? Have you ever said, I demand the sun to come up and I'm in charge of the sun? Have you ever said something like that? Have you caused the dawn to know its place? God's saying is, I do it all the time. I'm in charge of this thing. Or you could look at it in the book of Matthew, Matthew 5:45. He says, for he makes the sun to rise on the just and the unjust. God makes it to rise, providentially controlling it. What am I saying? Is if God did not command the sun to rise tomorrow, you'd never see it. Because God is providentially governing all of these things. What about animals? We've got animal life all over the world. What's going on with these animals? Let me give you this from my favorite book, Job. God appoints fish. God appoints worms. And when God appoints, or a better translation, God commanded a fish. God commanded a worm. You know what the fish and the worm did? Exactly what God told them to do. Or Jesus would say it this way. You want an observation that you can look at to determine these things? Look at the birds of the heavens, Jesus would say. Look at the birds of the air. They don't sow and they don't reap. They don't have no tractor and they don't have no barn. They got no place to store anything, but yet your heavenly Father feeds them every day. Think of that. Every bird on the globe is being fed by the hand of our Father, who is providentially supplying their food all over the globe. That's what Jesus says. And then, you have to get that last part. Are you not of more value than they? And so if God's providence would secure the hunger of a bird, then surely God's providence would feed you as well. I've seen the young and I've seen the old, but I've never seen the righteous begging for bread. The God of providence can and will supply. Jesus also went on to say, are not two sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one. Think of this. Think of the last part of this verse. Talk about the sparrow. Not one sparrow has ever fallen to the ground apart from, distinct from, the will of God. There was never a sparrow that was going across and died and hit the ground, fell out of the tree and hit the ground, apart from the providential will of God, because God was sustaining their life. Now, this is one of those humorous examples that you'll all laugh at, but if you can move past the laughter and get to the heart of what I'm saying as far as example, that would be better, and we can laugh about it later. But in all seriousness, my family and I were in South Texas, and we were contemplating the call to come to seminary and move and all of this stuff. And so the reality of it is we were under pressure. The temptation for anxiety and worry was escalating, and I didn't understand providence back then like I may understand it now. And so we were really on edge, wondering how all of this thing could work out. And we had no money, we have nobody here, we didn't know how any of these things would work out. And I got a wife and kids, and I'm scared. And so I have this truck, Yes, it's a Ford truck. Get over it. And so a 3/4-ton truck that I paid way too much money for. It was very, very nice. And payments, I don't know, $400 or $500 a month. Some crazy deal. We can't come to seminary with no job and no income and keep this truck. You can't. It's not going to work. And so we're praying and wondering. And in my truck, yes, it breaks down. It's in the shop under repair. How do you sell an overpriced truck in the shop, broken down, to a world out there that has trucks all over the place? How do you do that? And so out of nowhere, the guy we does not even know decides he wants to buy our truck that's in the shop broke down. But there's a problem. The banks put a hold on loans when there's a hurricane in the Gulf. And there's a hurricane in the Gulf. He wants to buy the truck, but the banks won't give him money because there's a hurricane. And this whole thing looks like there's no way this will work. God providentially guided the hurricane. God providentially guided the buyer. God providentially took the truck to the shop. God was working all these things out in order that we would know and understand who our God is and that we could trust Him even when nothing else seems like it's going to work. The truck sold, the hurricane went away, we moved here, and God supplied and everything. God's providence is real. You can trust Him. I needed to understand that God's in charge of the hurricane. I needed to understand that God moves buyers. I needed to understand that God supplies for His children. Providence in circumstances. Providence in circumstances. Random or chance events. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Proverbs tells us in Proverbs 16:33. Jonah tells us this. They want to, what's the problem? What's going on here? Come, let's cast lots. And let's learn on whose account this calamity has come upon us. And they cast lots, and you've got all of these sailors. And wow, just a lucky day. It identified Jonah. God providentially overseeing. Here, let's draw straws and figure this out. Who brought sin in the camp? We got all of these people. Whose fault is it? One. Oh, it's Achan. You see, have all this lots, or the drawing of straws, or the rolling of dice, if you will, but God's providence behind this, guiding it together for His purpose. Let's say a word in circumstances about national affairs. We're concerned about ISIS. We're concerned about our country. We're concerned about different things that go on around the world, and they bother us greatly, and they ought to. Well, let's get a biblical understanding. God makes nations great. God destroys nations. God enlarges nations, and God leads them away. Job 12:23. Psalm 22:28. He rules over all nations. Acts 17:26. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, and He has determined allotted periods, and He has set the boundaries for where you dwell. Why do you live in Azle? Because God brought you here. Why is your existence in the state of Texas? Because that's where God put you. Why is John Speed back in New York? Because God's providence took him back there. Why is Jonathan in Mexico City? Because God's providence took him there. God's governing these things. Or let us learn about national things from the mouth of Nebuchadnezzar as he's out eating grass like a cow in the middle of the field. And he lifts his eyes to heaven, and his reasoning returns to him. He says, "You are the most high God." National leaders brought down to eat grass like a cow, looking up and saying, "You are God." Or take somebody like the king of Nineveh, and here he is in all of his pagan idolatry and all of his wickedness, and this crazy prophet comes in and says, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown," and see God take the king of a nation and throw him down in dust and ashes and covering himself and crying out for mercy that if perhaps God may relent of the disaster He said He would do, and He will not do it. God can take and do anything He wants with kings, nations, countries, and peoples because He is the providential God over all national affairs. Now let's bring it down to a personal level in circumstances. Every aspect of our lives is under the providence of God. Dependence for food. Give us this day our daily bread. What are we saying? We are saying, God, you provide every morsel of food that we eat. What about my needs? He says to the Apostle Paul, Philippians 4:19, and my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. All of your needs are providentially met by God. How about your days? Are your days planned out? Is there providence in the backdrop that has kept you alive this long? Is there providence that sees you through? Can you die early? Can you die late? Is there a God that has made a plan here? Or is God in heaven wondering how your life is going to work out? Psalm 139:16. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. They were all written out before you were even existing in your mother's womb. What about our actions? In Him we live and move and have our being. Our steps. Proverbs 20, verse 24. A man's steps are from the Lord. Proverbs 16:9. The heart of man plans his way. The Lord establishes or directs his steps. How about success? How about failure? Look, Psalm 75, 6 and 7. For not from the east or from the west, not from the wilderness comes lifting up. It is God who executes judgment. He puts down one, He lifts up another. Success and failure. He puts down one, He lifts up another. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones, and He has exalted the humble estate. God brings success and failure. What about children? Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. They're the fruit of the womb of reward. God gives children. Talents and abilities. You say, well, I have this talent and I have this ability. Because God not only providentially gave it to you, but God providentially sustains your talents and abilities. Psalms 18:34. 1 Corinthians 4:7. For who sees anything different in you? Who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? What do you have that you didn't get? If you received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? Whatever talent or gift you have was given to you by God. God provided it for you and sustains it in you. Psalm 18:3 talks about David. David was training. You would think he trained with a bow, accurate with a bow. He was a person who was very familiar with the bow. Listen to this. David says, He trains my hands for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. David trained, David worked, but he understood it was God who provided him the ability to work the bow. About the circumstance of rulers or kings. You know the verse quite well, Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever He will. Ezra 1:1 and also Ezra 6:22. He moves Cyrus to do this, moves Cyrus to help another nation. God controls those type of circumstances. How about your desires, your inclinations? Philippians 2:13. It is God who works in you to will and work for His good pleasure. Why do you come to church? Why do you worship? Why do you serve God? Why do you read? God works this within you to accomplish His good pleasure. How about evil and good? This is where it could have been a whole sermon in and of itself. But out of all the ones we can do, this is an extremely brief presentation of good and evil. Are you ready? How does providence work when there's evil in the world and there's good? How can you say providence when you got evil and good going on at the same time? Listen to it from the life of Joseph. Starting in Genesis 37 and just going fast through the story. They hated him, his brothers, hated him. They could not speak peacefully to him. They hated him even more. They hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. His brothers were jealous of him. Come now, the brothers say, let's kill him. Let's throw him in a pit, and let's say a wild beast ate him up. Let's do that. Hate this little brat. Snot-nosed brat, kill him, get him out of here. Let's take him, at the advice of Reuben, they throw him in a pit. We'll just leave him for dead. All of those things. Joseph says in Genesis 45:5, Do not be distressed. His brothers come, see who he is. Do not be distressed. Don't get all worked up here. All these evil things you did and that you're accountable for doing, don't get all distressed about this. Don't be all angry with yourselves because you sold me like a piece of property. God sent me here to preserve life. Are you telling me, preacher, that God can take the evil of mankind and so be providential in it that he could move it for his glory and the good of his people? Yes. God took all the evil you did in order to put me here in this place that I may preserve life. Or, of course, the most famous verse, as for you, you meant, your intention and your heart was evil to me. But God meant it for the very opposite, and God won. God trumped your evil. God meant it for good, to bring about many people should be kept alive, and they are. God's providence. That's one grand story that you all know, and the grander story you would know is the greatest story of all time, and that is the story of Christ. That is the story of Christ. And how is that a grand event in the sense of evil and good? This way. For truly in this city, they said in Acts, they were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel. And they're all gathered together against Christ. What are they going to do? To do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. I'm going to take all of mankind together around Christ and to do wickedness unto him for the greatest of good. God's providence. Acts 2:23, though he was delivered up according to God's determined plan and foreknowledge, you used lawless people to nail him to a cross and kill him. Evil and good, God providentially over both and bringing the greatest victory ever, Christ's triumph over death, hell, and the grave. All right, if you want a quick lesson from Jonah, it's real easy. Who threw Jonah into the sea? Well, the first answer is, well, I look at Jonah chapter 1, and he told the sailors, cast me in, the water will become calm. They picked up Jonah, and they threw him overboard. Obviously, the pagan sailors threw him overboard. Go to chapter 2, and Jonah starts praying to the God of heaven. And as he's praying to the God of heaven, he says to the Lord, for you cast me into the deep. And the floods came over me, and they surrounded me, and the waves and billows passed over me. Jonah understood that God's providence would be used by the hand of pagans to throw him overboard, but Jonah knew that God was behind the whole deal for his sanctification and good, that he may accept the call and be obedient to the call to go to Nineveh. In every circumstance, God's providence is actively at work. And the illustration for me in circumstantial things that I will never get over is this one short story of my life in northern Peru. In the most wicked city that I have ever been to in my entire life, where everybody drives these three little motorcycles. You got a little seat on the back and a little driver up front. You pay your fare and you get on the back of this little motorcycle and they take you where you're going to go. And you can actually stop by a tree and they have gasoline and little plastic Coke bottles, and you can buy a Coke bottle of gas and put in your little motorcycle. And so it's wicked city in the middle of the night. And here I am riding around in the back of this little taxi. Things seem to go fine. We finish up. I'm fast forwarding the story. We get to a place to preach in the middle of the night, 10 o'clock at night. Me and Paul Washer and Paul Walker, we show up at this place to preach. We rode in this little car, and I got out of the car, and I reach in my pocket to get these 2 coins. And they're not there. They're not there. These are my favorite coins. They're not in my pocket. I search the car. Search all around. There are no coins. I go into a panic attack because I've lost these coins. And they probably don't have too much inherent value, but they're valuable to me. And so I go into a panic. And in that moment of panic, God taught me that I had more concern and passion for 2 coins than I did the souls of men. And God broke me and I wept because of my inordinate love for 2 coins rather than the souls of men. And I had to work through that and come to the understanding that I need to get myself right and value souls more than I do coins. But as you see, I still have the coins. Where'd they go? When I was riding the little motorcycle taxi in the middle of this city, they fell out of my pocket on the side of the road. we're teaching in a theological seminary, and of all these people that are walking down the streets, one of the students was walking down the sidewalk and saw these coins. And he just picked them up. He didn't know they were mine. He just picked them up. And the next day, he's standing at the seminary, and he's kind of playing around with them. And my friend, Paul Walker, knows what I've gone through in losing these 2 coins. He says, "Hey, what do you have there?" And the guy showed him these 2 coins. He said, "I know whose they are." And God took them away from me, taught me a lesson, and gave them back to me. What I'm saying to you is, even down to the losing of 2 coins, God's providence is absolutely true. And we're to trust Him that He's working in every circumstance. And lastly, and most briefly, providence and His governing work, sanctifying us, molding us, and shaping us. This is God's government. Psalm 103:19. The Lord established His throne in the heavens, and His kingdom is over everything. Psalm 115:3. Our God is in the heavens, and He does whatever He pleases. Daniel 4, verse 35. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and He, God, does according to His will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay His hand or say to Him, "What have you done?" Romans 11. From Him, through Him, to Him are all things. To Him be glory forever and ever. Amen. 1 Corinthians 15:27. God's put all things in subjection under His feet. Ephesians 1:11. In Him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of Him who works all things according to the counsel of His own will. Philippians 4 and verse 5. We come back there now. As we come back to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 5, I say this. God is provident. Providence is at work in all of creation. God's providence is reigning over every circumstance. God's providence is governing the affairs of all of creation. Okay? That's the biblical position of providence. And Paul says here, the Lord is near. Think. The God who controls the weather and the grass, everything, and His will is always accomplished because He's able to accomplish it, is near to you. Do not be anxious. Why would you be anxious? Why would you worry when we have this as our God? So knowing God and having a right view of God really puts a large dent in anxiety. So whatever unfolds this day, you can confidently hold your head up and say, my God reigns, and I can trust Him. And as I said last week, Christians ought to be the calmest people on the face of the earth because we know who our God is. Let us pray.